Hello and welcome again to Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White, and I'm so excited to have virologist Rich Condit on as co-host today. Rich has been on the show several times before and my previous podcast as well. He's very busy in retirement on TWIB, This Week in Virology, which provides tremendous insights several times a week about the coronavirus and many other viruses that have affected us and will continue to affect us into the future. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Offit, who is the director of the Vaccine Education Center and an attending physician in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's an expert in vaccines, which is the topic of today's conversation. Not just current vaccines, but their history. He's also the Maurice R. Sullivan Professor of Vaccinology at the Perelman, is that how I said it? Perelman or Perelman? Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And Maurice Sullivan is the subject of his 2007 book, Vaccinated, which we're going to talk about today. Dr. Offit is an internationally recognized expert in the fields of virology and immunology and was a member of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He's a member of the Food and Drug Administration Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee and a founding advisory board member of the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research, as well as a member of the Institute of Medicine and co-editor of the foremost vaccine text, Vaccines. He's also a recipient of numerous awards, and he's published more than 150 papers in medical and scientific journals. He's also the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq, recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC. He is also the author of 7 medical narratives, including The Cutter Incident, Vaccinated, Deadly Choices, Bad Faith, and Bad Advice, as well as others. I actually first heard Dr. Offit interviewed on This Week in Virology, and that encouraged me to read his book, Vaccinated. So, Dr. Offit, welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And welcome to you too, Rich.
Sure. Great to be here again, Chris.
So, your book focuses in particular on one very special researcher who was responsible for preventing the deaths of possibly hundreds of millions of people moving forward into the future. Can you talk about Maurice Sullivan?
Right. No, you could argue that if you had to pick one person who has had more impact in terms of our longevity than anybody else in this world, I think it would be Maurice Sullivan. He did either the primary research or development on 9 of the 14 vaccines that we give to infants and young children. It is a remarkable accomplishment. What amazes me the most is that no one knows his name. And I think the reason that no one knows his name is that he worked for a pharmaceutical company, which is how he was able to do it. I mean, he was a brilliant scientist, but by being in a pharmaceutical company, he was able to have the resources and at least development expertise that he would not have been able to have in academia. But we don't like our heroes to come from industry. We like them to come from academia. And I think that's why, in many ways, he is just unknown.
That culture has changed a little bit, hasn't it? I mean, you point out in the book, I was shocked but I guess not too surprised that his PhD advisors actually threatened not giving him his PhD if he were going to go into industry or something like that. Is that right?
That's right. They wanted him to continue to carry on the mantle of teaching in academic institutions. I mean, somehow it was selling out to go into industry, but he grew up on a farm in sort of rural Montana, and he was used to making things, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to make things.
And I really love that you talk a lot about his childhood too, because that certainly played a role in his work ethic and the kinds of insights that he had. I'm thinking about things like chickens, for example. There's a lot of chickens in this book too.
That's right. No, that's right. He grew up on a farm. So he often said chickens were his friend, and when he then went about making his vaccines, like the rubella vaccine or the German measles vaccine or the measles vaccine or the mumps vaccine, which the virus from which he obtained, actually the original virus from his daughter. He often used chicken embryos as a way to attenuate those viruses, meaning passage the virus in chicken embryos, introduce a series of essentially blind genetic mutations. But so a lot of chickens died at his hands. I'm not sure why he considered them his friend, but in any case, it served the public good.
You say in the introduction or preface that you had an opportunity to interview him. And there's lots of, I assume, quite direct quotes in the book from him. I'm interested in how you came to know him and how you came to do those interviews.
No, good question. I came to know him because when we created the strains that became the bovine human reassortant vaccine Rototec, I mean, it was Merck that made that virus. I mean, we did the research. We did the 10 years worth of research that allowed us to make strains that we thought could be a vaccine. But only pharmaceutical companies have the resources and expertise to make it a vaccine. And so that's when I first met him. I first met him around 1990 or so. 25 years before he died. So I had known him for all that time. He was a frightening character. I mean, he was that rare combination of somebody who was brilliant, remembered everything, and was gruff. I mean, when I did the interviews with him, I came to do the interviews with him largely just selfishly. I mean, when he was diagnosed with a disseminated, what was felt to be likely a primary pancreatic cancer, he was given roughly 6 months to live. This was in sort of October of 2004, and was given 6 months to live, and really basically lived about 6 months. And I thought, here's this remarkable man, and all these wonderful stories are going to die with him. And I asked him, would it be okay with him if I just sat down with him a week, once or twice a week, to just interview him for myself? I actually just wanted to learn what he knew. That was it. Completely selfishly. And then I was at a party once where he was there and his wife was there, Lorraine, and she described me as his biographer. And I thought, oh, they think I'm writing a book about this. So I thought, all right, a book it is. But the hard part with interviewing him was, first of all, he wanted to write his own autobiography. So he was very careful about what stories he was willing to give me. As it got closer and closer to his death, and he saw he wasn't going to be able to do what he hoped he could do, he then became a little more forthcoming. Although it's interesting, when he passed away, he gave me the roughly 40 pages that he'd worked and he'd written. And to know Maurice Sullivan is to know that basically he never got out of the time of Charlemagne. I mean, he was still talking about his German roots at the beginning. He never got out of the time of Charlemagne. And also he was very suspicious of the recording device, which I would sort of put in front of him. He would always sort of look at it out of the corner of his eye. And then at the end of the interview, usually I would turn it off, and then out would come all these great stories, because he just didn't want to have his voice recorded. And I would go to the car and just try and write down as much as I could, so I would remember it.
Oh gosh. And it occurs to me that why is it, well, were you the first person to really kind of emphasize his grand role in vaccines in publication?
Well, anybody who was in the vaccine world knew who he was. I mean, he was a force. I mean, he was at President National, scientific meetings. He was a person everybody turned to. I mean, he was a brilliant guy who understood the field. So, and he'd been on, I mean, just in terms of being hidden from the public, when his measles vaccine launched, I mean, he was on, and mumps vaccines, he would be on like CBS News with Charles Perrault. You would see him there occasionally being interviewed. Same thing with hepatitis B vaccine. So you would see him occasionally on TV, but I think most people didn't know who he was. Although that said, most people don't know who scientists are for the most part. I think one of the challenges in writing the book also was, he grew up in in eastern Montana, and also was in the Army at the Walter Reed Army Medical Research Institute, and he cursed all the time. And so here you're doing these interviews where you're recording him. What do you do? I mean, do you have this sort of Richard Nixon expletive deleted solution, or do you just put ellipsis, the ... or do you just put it in there, which I did. And so it was probably the only book that has the phrase polymerase chain reaction in the same sentence with the F word.
So what vaccines was he involved in?
So the measles vaccine, he created the first measles vaccine. The original measles vaccine came in '63. He modified it, so the final vaccine, the one we use today, basically was in '68. It's his mumps vaccine. It's the Geraldine strain. Geraldine Hilleman was his daughter. I mean, he isolated the original virus from her. He made the first Rubella vaccine in 1969, although that was replaced by Stanley Plotkin's RA273 strain in 1979, so 10 years later. He had a hand in the conjugate pneumococcal vaccine and the conjugate Haemophilus influenza B vaccine. He certainly was a major force, and he was the developer of the first hepatitis B vaccine, the so-called plasma-derived or serum-derived vaccine, and also the recombinant vaccine, which followed. He was the primary researcher and developer of the hepatitis A vaccine. So those were all his vaccines.
Amazing. I have down here on my list too, chickenpox. Did he have a role in that?
That's right. So Takahashi in Japan was the first to sort of create that strain, but then he essentially developed and produced that vaccine. Yeah.
One of the things that I like about the book is that you have very nicely interwoven the biography of Hilleman with what turns out to be really a history of vaccinology. Okay, and it really works out very nicely. And my favorite chapter is this one called 8 Doors. Okay, where you discuss the discoveries and innovations and conceptual leaps that went before Hilleman that allowed him to do what he did. Introduce the chapter you introduced with that famous quote from Newton about standing on the shoulders of giants.
That's right.
And I found that really good. And in particular, there's one thing in particular that actually, as I was reading the book, early on, you're talking about blind passage in cell culture attenuating a virus. And I thought, how did he know how to do that? And then, of course, 8 Doors comes up, and you talk about that innovation coming from Max Tyler. Okay. And I wonder if Max was really the first guy to do that, or whether he was standing on somebody's shoulders, because that strikes me as a remarkable leap of in concept that passage in culture would attenuate a virus.
I think that's exactly right. And he was really the first person to win a Nobel Prize for that observation. I mean, what he did was he took yellow fever virus, which was essentially a human pathogen, not an animal pathogen, and then he serially passed it in like mouse embryo cells and chick embryo cells, thus introducing a series of blind genetic alterations or changes that allowed the virus to still reproduce itself when put back in people, but not so much so that it could cause disease. And the birth of live attenuated viral vaccines, completely, just making it up. I mean, he didn't know anything about this. I mean, it's not like he, because this was in the 1930s and 40s. He didn't know anything about, genetic changes for that virus. It was just pure phenomenology. Give him credit, and that to me was the seminal Nobel Prize, because that opened the door then for all the subsequent live attenuated viral vaccines that followed. He was a South African who moved to the Rockefeller Institute in New York as a young man and did this work. And for his Nobel Prize, actually, he was asked the question, what are you going to do with this prize money, which I think at the time was like in the mid $30,000 range. And he said he was going to buy beer and also buy tickets to the Brooklyn Dodgers game. I think there was money left over, but that's what he said.
And I guess in a way, he's standing on the giants of people who were doing the epidemiology at the turn of the century, people like Gorgas and Reed and people like that, who were looking into mosquito diseases like yellow fever in Cuba and the Canal Zone, but they weren't looking at this same kind of biological process that Tyler was.
Exactly. I think it's generally we give Nobel Prizes for technological achievements, not public health achievements. I think which is why Tyler won that Nobel Prize, and similarly with people like John, the people who were involved with the first polio vaccines, being able to grow those viruses in non-neural cells was a technological leap. So Jonas Salk doesn't win the Nobel Prize, but John Enders and Fred Robbins and Tom Weller win the Nobel Prize for that technological leap. But again, if you ever gave a Nobel Prize for a public health achievement, I think Maurice Sullivan should have done that. Although I argued in this book that I thought Maurice Sullivan should have won the Nobel Prize for his work on interferon. He was really the first one to figure out how to mass produce it, to predict that it would have anti-cancer effects, which it did, predicted it would have antiviral effects, which it did. He published a series of 6 papers in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that were seminal in terms of the work with interferon. And when he was dying, I was at a meeting once where I sat next to Sven Gard, who was at the Karolinska Institute and was on the Nobel Prize committee. And I tried to lobby him, for this, and it just didn't happen. And also, for the most part, with the exception of Ralph Steinman, it's very hard to win the Nobel Prize posthumously.
Yeah. So back to the attenuation thing for a minute, because the attenuated virus, live, what we call live, or active. When it comes to viruses, living and dead are squishy terms. Okay. But live attenuated vaccines are one of the fundamental platforms for vaccinology, and maybe for the non-science listeners out there, you could give sort of your spin on how this process of passaging in cell culture leads to attenuation, and what those vaccines are about.
Right. So take the first live attenuated viral vaccine, the yellow fever vaccine. So this is a virus which is really a human pathogen solely. It is not adapted to growth in non-human cells. So what you do then is you cause it to be adapted to growth in non-human cells by just serially passing it. And each time you pass it in cells, you're selecting for strains that are more and more adapted to that particular cell substrate, whether it's chicken cells or mouse cells or rat cells or ferret cells or whatever you're using. And with that, you're introducing a series of blind genetic alterations. So to emphasize the word blind, I mean, you really don't know whether or not what you're doing is working until you put it back in people, which is what happens. I mean, people would take a virus and they would sort of get it to grow better and better, let's say in chick cells, and then put it into people to see whether or not, one, it induced an adequate immune response, and sometimes it was you passed it too much and it didn't do that, and two, to make sure that it was safe, and sometimes you didn't pass it enough and it was still causing mild illness. What you would think would be the right way to do it would be okay, let me have an animal model that is perfectly predictive of man, where when I give this virus, I get a disease that is virtually identical to the disease that we see in people, and then just figure out the gene or genes that are associated with virulence, and then do site-directed mutagenesis in those genes. Let's just do it that way. And we still don't do it that way. It's just hard to do this. It's an art. It is, which is to say, you just learn as you go. It's amazing that he was able to make so many so quickly. That's the hardest vaccine to make. I mean, with COVID vaccines now, you look at all the different strategies that are being used, and there are groups that are working with live attenuated viral vaccines, but you knew those were going to be the slowest.
Right.
And what I really appreciate about your book when you're explaining that is that I can start to visualize what's actually taking place, the passaging through these animals over and over and over again. But I guess I would love for the listeners, the lay listeners especially, to understand, why is it that if you pass it through another animal, or an embryo that is of something that used to be alive, that why is it that when it becomes more adaptive to that organism, how is it introducing it to a human going to induce an immune response? Or why does it?
Right. So as you get it to grow in cells in which it normally doesn't grow, in order to adapt to that, there are a series of genetic alterations that occur. And you hope that those genetic alterations, although you have to hope this is true, you don't know this is true, you hope that those genetic alterations involve virulence genes, meaning genes that determine the degree to which it causes disease. But doesn't really in any way negatively affect the genes that code for proteins that induce neutralizing antibodies or induce cytotoxic T cells. You hope that those two things are true. When we made our rotavirus vaccine, rotavirus, fortunately, is a segmented genome. So when we did our studies in experimental animals, which we did for like 10 years, I mean, you could make then you could take two viruses, one of which was, say, virulent for mice, caused disease in mice, and one of which didn't cause disease in mice. And then you could make these kind of reassorted viruses, which would say contain one or more genes from the virulent strain, or one or more genes from the avirulent strain. And you could then identify what genes were associated with virulence, which is what we did. So cow rotaviruses cause disease in calves, but they don't cause disease in babies, and vice versa. So we basically went to the large animal facility at Kennett Square, part of the University of Pennsylvania's Veterinary School of Medicine, collected diarrheal stools from calves, adapted those stools to growth in cell cultures so we could easily work with them, knowing that calf rotaviruses didn't cause disease in people because species barriers with rotaviruses are high. And then we just did the work in the laboratory to see whether or not we could create strains that had the best of both worlds, meaning the genes that coded for proteins, because we had reassorted human genes into that. the genes that coded for proteins that evoke neutralizing antibodies or cytotoxic T cell response, but not the genes that were associated with virulence. And that's what we did, thus summarizing 10 years of work in about a minute and a half. That's what we did. And so we invented a vaccine for mice. That's what happened. So, and then, you have to hope that the findings that you have in experimental animals in any way relate to what happens in people. Because as David Weiner, who is a wonderful vaccinologist at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, says famously, mice lie and monkeys exaggerate.
Right.
So you have to put it in people and then slowly see whether or not it's safe and effective in people.
Yeah, you described this idea of doing a very targeted mutagenesis, very deliberate mutagenesis to come up with an attenuated virus. And I think that one thing that people don't fully appreciate is that after all of these years, we still don't really very well understand all of the factors associated with virulence, probably very few of them. And we don't understand, how a virus is tuned to one organism and not another organism, exactly what those barriers are. And you also mentioned finding an animal model that appropriately mimicked the human situation. That also is very difficult. So there's huge barriers remaining to doing this in a targeted fashion.
That's exactly right. Animal models especially. It's hard to find animal models that predict events in people.
And because the aim of my program is to kind of look at really scholarship that analyzes controversial issues, then what is it that is, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, I'm sure, but if you could pick one or two, what is it that's controversial about vaccines?
Right now, yes. What is it that isn't controversial about that? Well, I think, what are you doing? You're taking a biological agent and injecting it into people. I mean, from the standpoint of the recipient, it's not hard to see why it is that people push back. I mean, you're injecting them with a biological agent that they don't understand to prevent a disease for the most part that they don't see. I mean, we give children polio vaccines, we give them vaccines to prevent diphtheria. I mean, these are uncommon diseases. And so, and we give, in the world of pediatric vaccines, we give vaccines to prevent 14 different diseases in the first few years of life. So you're giving as many as 26 inoculations in those first few years, as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases people don't see, using biological fluids people don't understand. I think it would be surprising if there wasn't pushback on vaccine.
Right. But there was pushback from the get-go, right? All the way back to Jenner, right?
Absolutely.
And there was pushback against his vaccine. So there's, well, I guess for the same reasons, right? It's that you're challenging somebody with a biological entity that they don't understand, and it's scary, yeah.
Right, and the Anti-Vaccination League, which was created within a few years of Jenner's vaccine, had as its heart what you see at the heart of this today, which is don't make me get a vaccine. I mean, it's, sort of my body, my choice, bodily autonomy, civil liberties, freedoms. And that was all the signs that people carried there in the early 1800s, within only a few years of Jenner's vaccine, all related to that. You see the same signs today, 200 years later.
It seems to me that there's several different sorts of issues involved. One is the hesitancy that you describe, the very reasonable hesitancy you describe on the part of individuals. And then there are these anti-vaccination crusades, okay, that I wonder about the motivations behind those. Some of the conspiracy theories, some of the misinformation it's hard for me to believe that some of the people promulgating this stuff actually believe that. Okay, do they? Does Wakefield believe that these vaccines cause autism, or is he using that for his own gain?
Yeah, I have my theories on this. I think Andrew Wakefield believes it. I think he strikes me as a narcissist. I think when you see him sort of in front of large groups now, he sort of sometimes wears all white. You have this kind of messianic feel about him. I think he just can't imagine he would ever be wrong. And although his initial hypothesis that the combination measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or MMR vaccine, caused autism was wrong, as has been shown now in about 18 studies in 7 different countries on 3 different continents involving hundreds of thousands of people. He still holds on to this. I would love, though, to do the experiment. I mean, give him a lie detector test and ask him, do you think this is true? I'm going to predict he does think it's true, because
Okay.
how could he ever be wrong? He's Andrew Wakefield. On the other hand, you have somebody like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a lawyer, who I think is advocating for a position. So he gets out there and recently in the Amish community in suburban Philadelphia in Lancaster County and just castigates vaccines. I mean, they're dangerous. I mean, they cause all manner of death, and goes on and on and on, and thus lowers the vaccine rates in that community. On the other hand, when he has a party at his home, you can't come to that party unless you're vaccinated. So I don't think he believes it.
And so what does he profit from this?
Well, certainly the Children's Defense Fund that he heads is very, very well funded. I mean, does he personally profit? I don't know, but I know that there are very wealthy philanthropists who give money to his organization. It's hard to watch. I would say, regarding the anti-vaccine movement, though, in general, although it's centuries old, I would say that there was never a politics to the anti-vaccine movement. I mean, when it started, well, I'll start you from the beginning. I think in the 1950s, when we made a polio vaccine, 5 companies made Jonas Salk's polio vaccine in 1955. One company made it badly. Cutter Laboratories failed to adequately inactivate polio vaccine. Right, grow the polio vaccine virus back up in cell culture, purify it, kill it with a chemical formaldehyde. That's what Jonas Salk did, and that's what those companies did. But there was a mass production problem, especially with one company, Cutter Laboratories of Berkeley, California, where they failed to fully inactivate the vaccine. Think about this. That meant that what happened is that there were about 120,000 children in the west and southwestern portions of this country that were inoculated with live polio virus. As a consequence, about 40,000 developed abortive or short-lived polio, meaning temporary muscle paralysis. 164 were permanently paralyzed, and 10 were killed. I think it was the worst biological disaster in this country's history, and did not alter the perception of vaccines. People still saw this for what it was. It was a manufacturing error. It was quickly corrected. We made a polio vaccine that was safe, and by the 1970s, we eliminated polio from this country. The birth, you would have think, I mean, imagine that happening today. I think the birth of the modern American anti-vaccine movement was in the early 80s, with this sort of incorrect notion that the pertussis or whooping cough vaccine caused permanent brain damage. There was a video call, or a 1-hour show that was produced on NBC called DPT Vaccine Roulette, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine roulette. And it showed, this dramatic series of, children who were, had bicycle helmets on, were sort of withered arms and legs, drooling, seizing, staring up vacantly into the sky. And the parents all told the same story. My child was fine. They got this vaccine. Now look at them. And that really was the first major hit on vaccines in this country. To the point there was tremendous litigation. Ultimately, it led to the birth of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act to try and, to some extent, protect vaccine makers. We were losing vaccines. We went from 27 vaccine makers in 1955 to 18 vaccine makers in 1980 to 4 vaccine makers very quickly because of that video. And then came Andrew Wakefield in the late 90s with MMR caused autism. But I would say on the left, it was, don't inject me with anything with a chemical name, all things natural. I'm just going to, natural immunity is best. And on the right, it was what you see now, which is this libertarian government off my back, freedom. And now I would say the anti-vaccine movement is wholly supported by the right. And it is a cultural issue. And so it swung wildly to the right, the anti-vaccine movement, with the support of people like Ted Cruz, who actually attacked Big Bird when Big Bird said that he gotten a vaccine, but his wing hurts a little bit, but he really thinks everybody should get a vaccine, and Ted Cruz attacks him for being a propagandist. Big Bird apparently is a propagandist.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's interesting.
Yes.
It's interesting, as you point out, that initially it was it became political, but there were factions on both extremes of the political spectrum that had their own reasons for pushing back against vaccination.
Yeah, if you the vaccine, the anti-vaccine movement was really on the run. I mean, with DPT vaccine roulette, the anti-vaccine movement was feted. I mean, you had people like Barbara Fisher who created what eventually became what was originally called Dissatisfied Parents Together, right? Get it, DPT, that became the National Vaccine Information Center, which was the one-stop shop for a lot of people looking for information on vaccines. She was on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. I mean, the anti-vaccine movement was center stage. And then Andrew Wakefield happened. And that really hurt the anti-vaccine movement, because not just that he was wrong, but he was fraudulent and wrong. I mean, he had created his own safer vaccine, which he patented. He had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Legal Services Commission to basically launder legal claims through a medical journal. That was what was going on. I mean, of the children in his paper, 5 of them were in the midst of suing pharmaceutical companies. When that all came out, and he was wrong, and he was fraudulent and wrong, and this country does not like a fraud. Then I think as his star fell, I think the anti-vaccine movement star fell, and they became more marginalized, which made them louder and meaner, and sort of the usual. They would shout, and they come to the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practice meetings and make their sort of Nazi Nuremberg references as a way to sort of get attention. But then COVID hit. And if you'd asked me before COVID hit, what did I think that would do to the anti-vaccine movement? I would have guessed it would have hurt it, because vaccines were a ticket out of this horrible, horrible pandemic, which has killed almost 1 million people in this country. But I was wrong, because they got embraced by the right. They became all part of this government off my back movement, and they are now better funded than ever before, and in many ways more influential than ever before.
That politicization is really a sea change. Is that right?
Yes, very much so.
So what do we do?
Well, I think you fight back the way that you can. I mean, there's a group called the Disinformation Dozen, which has about 65% of the impact, meaning when people refer to things and tweet and retweet or forward things, Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, it's concentrated into about really 12 people or groups. So I think that both Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok could do a much better job at limiting their impact. They could, but they don't. That would be one thing. I think the government actually, through public service announcements, could do a much better job at appealing to the emotion of this, which I think they don't do. I'll give you specific examples. I mean, as a child, I'll tell you how old I am, I remember those cigarette smoking commercials. I mean, I remember William Tallman, who played Hamilton Berger on Perry Mason, right? He was the guy that always lost. I remember him getting out there with Yul Brynner and talking about how they had lung cancer from smoking and they were going to die, and they did. I mean, that really had an impact on me. I think that the anti-drug attempts with, show an egg, this is your brain, then crack it, put it onto a skillet, and then fry an egg, and then this is your brain on drugs. Any questions? That actually had an impact. And I think we should be far more emotional about this. Talk to parents whose children have died from this, who could have gotten a vaccine. Tell those stories. And I think that would help, but we don't do that.
Even a case recently, I heard about a friend of a friend who insists that her child got autism from vaccines, and so won't get the mRNA vaccines even today. And so when I heard this story, I was thinking, well, I know this person, I care about them. How do you get into a conversation with someone like that? And there's tons of people like that.
Yeah, I think here's the good news. When Andrew Wakefield raised his hypothesis, we'll give it the nicest thing we can say about that the MMR vaccine caused autism, that precipitated a lot of money spent to answer that question. Now, I would argue it was a fruitless, nonsensical hypothesis, given what he said. I mean, what he said at the beginning was, when you're inoculated with a combination MMR vaccine, that overwhelms your immune system, that weakens your immune system. So much so that it allows for measles virus to travel to your intestine, reproduce itself in intestinal epithelial cells, enter the lymphatic system bloodstream, travel to the brain, cross an intact blood-brain barrier, and cause autism, for which he had not a shred of evidence. I mean, he could have looked to see whether there was any blunting of the immune response. He didn't. He could have looked on biopsy materials to see whether there was evidence of vaccine virus replication in those intestinal cells. That wasn't done, or was done incorrectly. He could have looked to see whether or not the virus this vaccine virus had entered the bloodstream and traveled to the brain, which he didn't do either. And he also argued that there was a that there was a toxin that was produced in all of this, that was casein or gluten or whatever is kind of appealing to the Whole Foods crowd, that was causing this, and he didn't do that. So he didn't support this at all. But in any case, studies were done to show that he was wrong. At the time those studies were done, I would say 90% of parents of children with autism thought that vaccines could have caused. If you asked them the question, this was done, do you think vaccines might have caused your child's autism? 90% would say yes. Following all those studies, now 15 years later, the Autism Science Foundation, which is Alison Singer's organization in New York, did a study asking parents the same question, and only 15% said yes. So those studies did make a difference, and that's all we can do. All we have on our side is logic and reason. I mean, as Neil deGrasse Tyson famously says, if someone's conclusion is not based on reason or logic, then reason or logic are not going to talk them out of it. That's all you have.
Yeah, this is we've kind of discovered this ourselves on TWIV. I fully support your idea that the emotional appeal is really important, because it's frankly, it's the emotional appeal that supports the anti-vax movement as well. It's anecdotes, it's individual stories of children supposedly being harmed by vaccines, and standing up with a bunch of statistics and stuff that make your eyes glaze over isn't going to combat that. However, what you're also saying is that all of the studies, if you can support that emotional appeal with a bunch of background studies that say that this emotional appeal of ours represents the truth, okay, that package could work.
I agree completely. I mean, you can't leave the science. I mean, that's what you have. That's what separates us from superstition and ignorance. But you have to frame it in a compelling, compassionate, and passionate way. And just to underline your point, I think my wife, who's a general practice pediatrician, who you just met, she went in the office one weekend day and was helping the nurse give vaccines. And so there was a 4-month-old sitting on her mother's lap while she was drawing the vaccine up into the syringe, the first vaccine she was going to give. The 4-month-old had a seizure and went on to have a permanent seizure disorder and was dead at age 5 of a chronic neurological condition. If she had given that vaccine 5 minutes earlier, there are no amount of statistical data in the world that would have convinced that mother of anything than the vaccine caused it. What do you think? I'm stupid? Child gets a vaccine, 5 minutes later has a seizure, now is dead from a chronic neurological disease. I'm the mother of a vaccine damaged child. You can see where the emotion of that comes from and how impossible it would be to talk someone out of that, no matter how many studies you show.
Do you think any progress is being made in terms of helping people understand and accept vaccinations?
A little bit. I mean, I think that where that's going to happen at some levels on the ground. So in the Philadelphia area, for example, there's an African-American physician named Ayla Stanford, who with a group of other physicians formed something called the Black COVID-19 Consortium, where she goes into the North Philadelphia community, primarily an African-American community, and convinces people to get vaccines. And she has. She's convinced like 4,000 people to get vaccinated who may not have otherwise gotten it. So I think that's where it has to happen. It has to happen in communities that are, say, unvaccinated or undervaccinated. There has to be someone who's trusted there, whether it's a religious figure or a physician who's been serving that community for a long time, who then goes into that community and really just shakes people by the shoulder and say, look, this has to happen. In the Amish community in Philadelphia, in suburban Philadelphia, in Lancaster County, it's a physician named D. Holmes Morton, who has served that community for decades and is trusted. And I think that's what has to happen. I think the government can encourage that kind of behavior. And to some extent they are a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be a federal thing. I don't think it's going to be a state thing. I think it's going to have to be local.
It occurs to me that a problem, in air quotes, is that COVID is maybe not quite nasty enough, right? Because there aren't enough people that die and the death is not quite gruesome enough. Smallpox killed 30% of the people that it infected, and it was gruesome. And you knew you were going to get it, even if you survived, if you lived in a big city. Likewise, polio hit kids and paralyzed them for life. So that's got the emotional impact of the virus itself was greater.
That's a good point. Although I'm having rounded at Children's Hospital this past week, and then in December I rounded. I would say in December when I rounded, we admitted 18 children to the hospital, 5 of whom went to the intensive care unit. I would like to show the videos of watching these children struggle to breathe, and then watching them wheeled up to the intensive care unit, sedated, put on a ventilator, watching those parents cry, and also this MIS-C, this multisystem inflammatory disease. This post-infectious inflammatory disease is gruesome. It's gruesome enough. I mean, those children have not only lung disease, they have heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, and sometimes the heart disease is pretty severe that causes them to go to the ICU because of the heart disease. And I think, I'm not sure people realize that this is not influenza. I mean, influenza is a respiratory virus that can cause pneumonia and kill you. This virus, it affects many other organ systems, in part because I think of the vasculitis that's induced. But look at those kids with multi-system inflammatory disease. It's pretty gruesome. And that's a disease of the 5 to 13-year-old with a peak at about 9 years of age. This is a disease of children. Although children definitely suffer the disease less frequently and less severely. When they suffer it, they can suffer it severely and it can be fatal. There's been 1,000 children roughly less than 18 years of age who have died of this virus. That should be enough. We have vaccines to prevent diseases that are far less impactful than that.
So again, it's your emotional appeal. People need to see that.
I think so.
I think you're right, though, Rich, too. The imagery matters, the visuals matter. And so if we don't see, I mean, and as you pointed out in the book, and Oshinsky points out in his book on polio too, so much of that was about the effort that was organized with the March of Dimes, and there were people that really made it a PR issue, so that it almost seemed like polio was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened, but really it was about the way that they elevated it, and there were other diseases that were even more dangerous, but this one, associated with the president and children, helped to mobilize the population, thus elevating Salk's status above somebody like Hilleman. I mean, I had actually, after the coronavirus began and lockdown, I printed out like a sheet of paper that was like a picture of Jonas Salk and put it up on my my wall to kind of honor him. But I didn't know about this guy Hilleman, who was much more responsible for saving people's lives, far beyond Salk.
The one thing that struck me though, I was a child of the 50s. I was born with club feet. I had an operation on my right foot that should have never been done because it was a completely failed operation. But it ended up with me in a polio ward for about 6 weeks, and so I saw that disease. And I wrote a book about that. It's called The Cutter Incident, which describes that thing that I just told you about. But we were united in our effort against polio. I mean, the March of Dimes was a private philanthropic group that really was Operation Warp Speed 1. I mean, that was, a private organization that paid for the research, they paid for the big phase 3 clinical trial. And while that trial was being done, they paid for the mass production of that vaccine at risk for those 5 companies who took no risk in making that vaccine. They helped build the buildings. I mean, that was Operation Warp Speed 1. And when that vaccine launched and you had, the problem with the Cutter incident, it was a blip. And we moved forward and eliminated polio from this country. Polio had no friends. That virus had no friends. COVID-19 has a great many friends. It does. I mean, people who are willing to put out misinformation out there, people on Fox who put Tucker Carlson gets out and says 3,300 people have died from COVID vaccines. That's just wrong. And polio didn't have to deal with that. It was a different time. I think it's a much more cynical, much more litigious, much more divided time. And so this war against this virus has in many ways become a war against ourselves.
You make an interesting point, though, about the apparent absence of appropriate promotions of the vaccine that make this emotional appeal. I mean, you remind me of those, "This is your brain on drugs," and the Yul Brynner lung cancer commercial. Of course, I don't watch enough TV, but I don't see anything like that. Why is this not being done?
I don't know. If you talk to people at the White House, they would argue it is being done, and they will show you films that are emotional. But I haven't seen them. I'm glad that they're doing that. I really wish they would be better at putting those public service announcements out there, especially for children. Because if you look at right now, we're about 65% vaccination rate, but if you had to pick the group that is the least vaccinated, it's people less than 30. So I really do think we need to focus on the young, and we're not doing so. Pediatricians become critical in this, but I agree with you, Rich. I think we need to get very emotional videos out. I mean, right now we're about to head into spring and summer. And with that, these numbers are going to come way down and people are going to feel good again. But once we head into October, November, and next winter, this virus will be back. I can be very confident that will happen. I think it's a coronavirus. It's likely a winter virus. And again, if we're relatively, and not only that, I mean, we are at risk of this virus as long as it circulates in the world. I mean, why do we still vaccinate children for polio in this country? We haven't had polio in this country since the 70s. We do it because it still exists in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And if we let our guard down, it could very easily come back. We're going to be dealing with variants of this virus in the world for a long time. And so we're going to need to have a highly vaccinated population. So although I think it is going to move to the endemic stage at some point, probably this year. And it's interesting that the terms are interesting. When you go from pandemic to endemic, you would think there's like a clear number, a black line that shows that X number of deaths per million means you're in an endemic stage. It's not. The term endemic really just means it doesn't change your life. And we're going to get to that point. We're at that point with flu. I mean, 2 years before this pandemic, there were about 700,000 hospitalizations and 60,000 deaths per year from flu, but we grandfather that in. We say, I can live with that. I mean, when I go to an Eagles game, and boo, like all the other Eagles fans who are watching those games, I mean, you're standing there with a lot of people close together, screaming and yelling. I probably would benefit from wearing a mask, right? Because, you know, I'm sure there's in the winter months that there's a risk I take. It's a risk I'm willing to take, and I'm sure we're going to get there with this virus. But we're going to need to have a highly vaccinated population or a protected population if we're going to deal with this in the years and arguably decades to come.
Well, you know, we're hitting on a theme here too, with the war on drugs aspect, as well as with the vaccine thing, and especially by comparison to the period of time with the Salk polio vaccine. We're dealing with culture wars ever since the 1960s in particular. And so, you know, you could see, you know, celebrities we're talking like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland talking about it was everybody's duty to send in just a little bit, one dime, right? So that we could, and everybody could understand that it was going to raise all the boats. But then since the 60s, we've been divided over so many things. And one of the major things that you talk about in here in your book is the aborted fetal cell line that came from the Swedish woman in 1961, and how people today, and I've heard this, you all probably have heard too, is people actually believe that they have to continue to abort fetuses in order to provide the material for the vaccines. Can you talk about that controversy?
Right.
The reality?
Yeah, no, actually, the cells that were obtained from that one single termination of a pregnancy in the early 1960s eventually made their way to the Wistar Institute and are called WI38 cells for that reason. They served then as the cell substrate for making of the Rubella vaccine, which Stanley Plotkin, my former boss, made. And so because of that, we don't have the 20,000 to 25,000 cases of congenital rubella syndrome every year. We basically eliminated rubella from this country in 2005. I mean, that's the power of that vaccine. And I don't think we've done a great job at educating people about that. I mean, to people, those kinds of diseases are just diseases from black and white photographs. They don't see that, first of all, the virus still does circulate in the world, and so we're always at risk for it. And actually, just to get a little off topic a second, what worries me the most about the current pandemic is, and this sort of engagement of the right in this kind of liberty, freedom, you know, the government off my back, and they don't want vaccines mandated for school. I fear that's going to spill over into they don't want any vaccine mandated for school. And if that happens, we're going to go back to where we were. And that really worries me a lot. But in terms of those cells, this is, you know, one could reasonably argue, look, one could say, look, I'm Catholic, these are abortions, and abortions is a sin worthy of excommunication, a sin where I don't get to participate in the sacraments of the Catholic Church. Therefore, I don't want to inject myself or my child with a vaccine that does contain, nanogram levels of this DNA that was obtained from this initial abortion. But you're right, from 60 years ago, we use the same cells. It's not like we keep doing abortions, but that went to the Pontifical Academy for Life for consideration years ago, at the time when, which is the major policy making body for the Catholic Church. At the time, Joseph Ratzinger was the head of it, who became ultimately Pope Benedict XVI. And he ruled that it was important for Catholics to get these vaccines for the same reason that all religions are asked to get this vaccine, because religions generally teach you to care about the health of yourself and your children and your neighbor, and therefore it was important to get the vaccine. So that has been vetted in a sense by the Catholic Church.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's what's so important. I mean, I actually heard of somebody recently who was asking for a military exemption so they wouldn't have to get the mRNA vaccine, because they believed that it came from aborted fetal cells. And of course, that didn't.
It doesn't actually. J&J's vaccine does, or it's not, doesn't come from it. It's just so it's a replication defective adenovirus type 26, which is grown in a cell line that actually it was obtained, I think, in 1985 from what was an abortion. So that is true. But again, it falls under the same category, but not the mRNA vaccine. So I'm not sure why they would say
But that J&J one, that doesn't come from that original Swedish one from 1961.
No,
that comes from a different one.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah,
So
there are
been at least a couple.
First 6 cells.
There are a few cell lines around that came originally from aborted fetuses, but I think that are used in these practices. But I think, once again, this is getting into, data and science that that doesn't resonate with the public as well as the emotional things, because I think people who aren't used to dealing with this have a hard time differentiating between an abortion, which is, a huge deal, and a cell line. They don't know what a cell line is. Okay, that these are cells in culture that were maintained for a long period of time. That just goes right by you. Okay, and what sticks is abortion. And so that's a hard concept to deal with.
I guess if we could quantify it, I'm just trying to think of how I could communicate with people. If I had a set number, is it 6 babies that have been aborted, that those cell lines of their lungs have been used, or is it 2, or is it 1? And then you compare it to the hundreds of millions of lives that have been saved and will continue to be saved. And then it just seems like a no-brainer.
I count 3. I count your WI31s and 2 different ones that gave rise to 293 cells and some other cell lines. So maybe 3. And you're talking about, how many, Paul?
Yeah, so I would say WI38, MRC5, PERC 6 cells, and then the other would be HEK.
Okay, so you count 4. How many lives? Millions, right?
Millions. Now, my favorite, Stanley Plotkin, who is the inventor of the current RE273 or Rubella vaccine. I mean, during the Rubella, when Rubella reigned in this country and caused not just children who had permanent birth defects of the eye, ear, and heart, including blindness and deafness, there would also be about 5,000 spontaneous abortions every year from women who were infected, typically in the first trimester, with Rubella. He would argue that his vaccine prevents abortions. so therefore, in theory, it should be embraced by Catholics.
Yeah, Rubella is another one that I think people have very little understanding of, and your book does a really good job with that. I wasn't conscious of Rubella epidemics that were really so devastating in terms of birth defects, which are just tragic. But as you say, the vaccines are a victim of their own success in a way, because you don't see these things.
Right, and just I know we're getting to the end of our time, but the most emotional scene for me with Dr. Hilleman was so here he is. He's got disseminated cancer. He knows he doesn't have that long to live. And he knew that the anti-vaccine movement, here he'd spent his whole life trying to make vaccines that would save children's lives, prevent them from suffering, prevent them from being permanently harmed, prevent them from dying. And he then watched the anti-vaccine movement start to take off. And I remember asking him, do you think there's anything we can do to educate people about this, short of having these diseases come back again and having to see how horrible they can be? And he spent a long time answering that question. I remember it was a January day. He was looking out the window in suburban Philadelphia, and he a wintry day, and he looked back at me and he said, "No, I think that's exactly what it's going to take."
Wow.
Definitely. Well, and your book does a great job of honoring him and really just documenting it. I know it came out 15 years ago, but I think it's timely for people to read it right now as well, so they can understand the broad scope and all the work and all the resources that have gone into this too. The laboratory work, the conferences, the publications, the experimentation, the places people had to go to acquire things like monkeys and fetal cell lines and all that is all told in there. And you cover many other controversies, including the controversy over the polio vaccine spreading HIV, and you dissect that in a very good way. I think I'd be remiss for our listeners too if we didn't at least broach the subject of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and how this may contribute to the worsening of the coronavirus situation there and infectious diseases. Do you two have any thoughts about this?
I defer to Rich on this.
Not much really. I don't, I would have to look into the actual situation in Ukraine. I don't know, and in Russia. I don't know what the status of the epidemic is there now. I do know that generally, when you have this sort of social upheaval, it has a dramatic effect on infectious disease. Just look at Africa, Paul. You probably can talk about this better than I can, but trying to distribute vaccines and take care of public health in a place like the Congo, where there's in a constant state of conflict, is very difficult. So I would imagine that not just coronavirus, but infectious disease in general is going to be aggravated by this situation. But in terms of specifics, I can't really predict.
No, I agree. I mean, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and all the turmoil that surrounded that, there was actually a massive outbreak of diphtheria in Russia at that time. So I mean, that's what happens when there's this kind of upheaval, and the healthcare system is affected, that you see things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of it that way. And maybe this is something that people don't fully appreciate either, in that managing public health properly requires a structure and requires people to, cooperate in a structured fashion, communicate with each other, disseminate the appropriate treatments and information, and et cetera. And where there's conflict, that structure is going to be disrupted and public health is going to suffer.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about refugees concentrating into areas, tuberculosis. I mean, is typhus still a problem? I know it used to be in the past, but when you have concentrations of people and there's lice around, I don't know if it still is, but certainly diseases of crowding will probably be exacerbated during this time. I really wanted to thank both of you for being on. I also, one last thing I wanted to see if you, just to acknowledge the passing of Dr. Paul Farmer, to a giant in public health. I got a chance to meet him in 2006 when he was doing a talk in Kansas City, Missouri, and stayed in contact with him afterwards too. It's a real shame that he had to pass at such a young age, 62. So yes. Thanks so much, Dr. Paul Offit and Dr. Rich Condit, for being on the show with us today. And if anybody is interested, give us a review, and please check out TWIV, where you can find Rich Condit on a weekly basis, and Dr. Paul Offit is on there several episodes as well, and check out any of his books too.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Nice seeing you.
Okay.